So according to some research coming out, it appears that the Sony brand has been pretty badly damaged due to the month-long hack attacks. So we're going to cover that in a bit. We're also going to cover the flat-out lies that Sony has told thus far, and then cover the latest developments. But first, a lot has changed since we last talked about this topic. If you've been keeping up with my Twitter feed or VGN, then you're probably in the loop and you know what's going on. If you haven't, then let me recap a few things that have happened, at least some of the bigger things. There's like so many parts to this story. So the last time we spoke, Sony had decided to pull the movie The Interview, which is the comedy which depicts the assassination attempt of Kim Jong-un. Now, after a vague 9/11 reference threat that, by the way, government and Homeland Security officials said wasn't credible, Sony offered movie theaters the option to back out of their contracts, and they weren't going to be forced to show the movie. Sony said, look, if you don't want to show the movie, that's fine. So then it was reported that several chains did back out and weren't going to show the movie. So Sony said that they were going to scrap the whole thing. They weren't going to show the movie, and they also made statements suggesting that they weren't even looking at a digital release. So this was probably the worst decision that Sony could have made. You had actors, you had directors, civil rights groups, the public, hell, even President Obama got up and slammed this decision by Sony. And you rarely have any sitting president come out and bash a company like the president did. Now, it did seem like after Obama spoke on this publicly and after the public was already outraged, it seemed that that was the turning point to actually get some wheels spinning in some of the executives' mind over at Sony. So after the president's meeting, Sony came out and they did an interview with the CEO for Sony Pictures, and he claimed that Sony wasn't cowering, Sony wasn't backing down, and hadn't given in to terrorist demands. Even though the terrorists demanded that Sony pull the movie, so Sony did. So, I mean, a lot of people look at that as bowing down to terrorist demands. Now, that statement would have been okay if it weren't for the fact that the CEO of Sony Pictures actually tried to blame the movie chains and the theaters for the movie being pulled. So you had Sony telling the movie chains, look, if you want to back out, you can. So then a few of them did back out, and then Sony just threw them all under the bus and then came out with a statement basically saying, look, we had no choice. Our hands were tied. We couldn't find anybody to actually show the film. Now, whenever this came out, I said, if you were following me on Twitter, that this was bullshit. Plenty of movies have limited releases that aren't shown in every theater. So to have a limited release of a movie is not uncommon. It happens all the time. Sony even does it all the time. So you could have either pulled the movie and made no money, or you could put it out in limited release form and make some of the money back. And then he was asked, well, what about digital distribution? If you can't get the movie theaters to show it, what about releasing it on other formats, like video on demand? And this was another flat-out lie that Sony told. He said that they couldn't find any distributor who were willing to take the film. They didn't have any way to release it because they weren't a movie theater. Which, of course, is absolutely a bullshit, bold-faced lie, considering what the hell is PlayStation but a format to push out content? And also, Sony owns Crackle. Yeah, that app where you can go stream videos. And let's not even bother mentioning how they have a YouTube channel and they have plenty of other avenues that they could have used to distribute the movie. And also not mentioning that there were actually other distributors who had stepped up that said that they would be willing to distribute the movie for Sony. So after this, the public was raging again. Sony finally started to backpedal. They started saying that they wanted to get the movie out somehow, some way. But behind the scenes, even up until just a couple of days ago, it was just Saturday, Sony was still bending over backwards to meet the demands of these cyber terrorists. The hackers had demanded that not only should Sony never release the film, but that they should also delete all the social media accounts for the movie. And sure enough, on Saturday, Sony went through and deleted the Twitters and the Facebooks and all that for this movie. So they were saying one thing, but again doing another. But moving over to present time. Early in the morning on Tuesday, the Washington Post broke a story that claimed that there were a lot of theaters who were actually begging Sony to let them show the movie on Christmas Day, which of course goes completely against the CEO's statements where he said they couldn't get any movie theaters to show it, so they had to pull the whole thing. So this story was starting to pick up traction, and then all of a sudden, a few hours later, Sony decided to finally grow a pair of balls and announced that they would indeed release the film to these theaters who wanted to show it on Christmas. And not only that, but they've also decided to release the movie on video on demand. So thank goodness they finally realized that they have a way to release it on demand. So they did this all while proclaiming and shouting from the roofs that they were standing up to those who tried to suppress freedom of speech. So it took them a while, but Sony finally made the right decision, and for that, I'm sincerely glad. But let's not miss the forest because of the trees. Some people tried to justify Sony's decision in the beginning to pull the movie because they went along with Sony's PR line that it was the theater's fault. They said, well, you know, if the theaters aren't showing it, it's not Sony's fault. They didn't have a choice. Well, now we know that that was a lie. And it was also said, well, Sony was just trying to save lives. Because if there was a threat, then it was best for Sony to pull the film. Which, obviously, Sony isn't too worried about threats because they're still showing it on Christmas Day. So that was also a lie. This decision to show the film is purely reactionary to the beating that they are taking in the public, in the press, in Hollywood, and from government officials. But the info is already out there. You're either going to take a beating now or have some kahunas to stand up and do the right thing and take it later. And you're not getting your leaked information back one way or another. They're just going to continue to hold you hostage. And one thing that I was really disappointed about with reading some of the comments from my last videos is how many people were okay with trying to appease terrorists, who were okay with freedom of speech taking a back seat for a veiled threat, which, by the way, if it is the North Koreans, they send out threats to the U.S. like every other week, okay? And also, there are threats on all sorts of public events. We don't shut down and go living in a bubble just because there is some just veiled threat. There is a threat if you get up and leave your house right now and drive to Walmart. There's a threat that somebody could run you off the road or something else crazy happen to you. But the easiest way to place chains of tyranny on somebody is to have them just stand still. I don't care if the movie is a comedy or how stupid it is or what it's about. It could be a documentary for all I care. But to have a major Hollywood studio who brings us crime-fighting movies, who brings us superheroes that we're supposed to look up to, and then to have that same studio grab its ankles and piss itself when it comes to real-life threats was completely embarrassing. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. According to a CNN poll, 62% of Americans say Sony overreacted by pulling the movie. And another research firm that studies consumer perception also has been calculating on a weekly basis the negative feeling that the public gets towards Sony during this month-long ordeal. And they say that Sony's numbers right now are the worst it's been in over 6 years. And if you actually read the comments that's on a lot of these articles that are being written, and again, these aren't gaming websites, these aren't related to PlayStation or anything else, there are a lot of people out there saying that they were taking their Sony products back that they had gotten for Christmas, or that they were done with anything Sony in the future. Now, of course, that's also reactionary, and it's just comments, so who knows who actually followed through with that. But the consensus was pretty clear. Americans don't like a pushover, and at least with this situation, the public could see through the fog and knew that they were being fed BS PR lines that didn't match reality. Those who give up liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Can Sony turn things around? Of course. They've been down this road before. But there are a lot of reports that Sony's security was an absolute joke. And Sony has got to turn around this perception. With them focusing on services and software, people don't want to put in their personal information to a company that can't even protect its own employees or executives. And that's going to take some money, a lot of money. The estimated cost, the last ones I read by experts, were putting the tab at close to $500 million. And that was just for Sony Pictures to get their computers and infrastructure back up. That wasn't including the movie losses or the lawsuits or actually upgrading the security. And the last time we talked, I told you that there were 2 lawsuits that had been filed. By now, there are at least 4 civil lawsuits, and certainly there are going to be more on the way. And another thing that doesn't bode well for Sony during this PR nightmare is how they have hired lawyers to go after the media who were reporting about the emails. So they have hired a big-time litigation lawyer just to harass the media. Which, by the way, it's completely legal for these journalists to report on this content because the Supreme Court decided back in the 90s that journalists can't be held responsible for reporting about stolen content so long as they weren't the ones who stole it. And just today I saw a report where Sony had sent a letter to Twitter threatening them if they didn't start taking accounts down that were spreading information about the leaks. So Sony is trying to plug the holes, but instead of hitting at the media, instead of blaming the theater chains, instead of playing the victim, it's about time that they start working on fixing their security and trying to build their reputation back, and maybe worrying about going more after the people who actually did this to you. I think that the announcement of them releasing the film in select theaters and on video demand is certainly a good start. I do not see Sony as the hero here in this situation, but I am glad that they at least decided to finally make the right decision. If you want to read more about it, links down in the description box. Be sure to follow me on Twitter for the latest breaking news as it happens, and stay tuned to VGN. That does for me, The Red Dragon. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.